Hi, everyone. Welcome to our People Plus Places, LA's multifamily housing origin story from bungalow courts to dingbats. I'm Adrian Scott Fine, the president and CEO for the Los Angeles Conservancy. So first of all, thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking some time out of your day to be part of this. The Conservancy's People Plus Places program in this series, we're now in our 5th year of doing this, and it's all about people focus or people-centric heritage conservation efforts and us sharing their stories. All of these past examples of our programs around People Plus Places are available and live on the Conservancy's YouTube page. So please feel free to check them out. They're all available there, as well as this program would be available following it, hopefully later this week. So look for that. We're also soon going to be announcing our next People Plus Places program, which will be in early May, where we'll be talking about some of our work we're doing with local partners on Terminal Island in San Pedro, and the last 2 buildings standing there that you can see here that help tell the story about the vibrant Japanese American community that once existed on this island, and also why it's important to keep these historic buildings. So encourage you to look out for this next People Plus Places program, and please join us for that as well. And while all of our programs and the People Plus Places and everything that we do are open to all, we also encourage you to join the Conservancy and our 4,500 plus members for even more access to our programs, events, exciting new member discounts that we're sharing very soon, and our new member publication called Landmark with our latest issue featuring a story on the LA fires. This issue will be issued and launched next week, so look for that as well. So today, we're focused on LA's older and historic multifamily housing. We'll be talking about a lot of different things through this hour conversation. We're going to be talking about different types of historic apartment living and typologies of multifamily housing. We're going to talk about who it has served throughout the years and perhaps who it has left out, why and how it developed the way it did. We'll highlight historic multifamily housing neighborhoods and also explain how single family and multifamily housing development in the city of LA, it has a long and sometimes uneasy relationship. And lastly, we're going to talk about why older existing multifamily housing is still in great need today and increasingly at risk, in some cases, ironically, for additional new housing in terms of this. And with the idea or the fact that 60% of Angelenos rent and housing costs are ever increasing, this is a highly relevant conversation that we've started as part of our work around our home campaign, which we'll explain a little bit further. But we also know that this conversation, when you talk about housing in Los Angeles, it's exceedingly complicated, and it needs to be unpacked to better understand, one, how we got here, but also how we're going forward in terms of a lot of the policies as well as state legislation that, again, exceedingly makes this a complicated conversation. So think of this as a start or the ongoing, but certainly not the end of the conversation, as well as the programming that we're going to be bringing forward from the Conservancy, as well as many partners across LA County are talking about in terms of housing and when we do this. Which is why today's program is a part of our home campaign, but it's also a companion to our upcoming Marvelous Mid-Wilshire Multifamily Tour we're doing on Saturday, April 19th. There you'll have a chance to tour historic multifamily housing, including some interiors. You'll have a chance to meet some longtime residents and hear their stories about Miracle Mile, Park La Brea, Beverly Fairfax. And as a teaser for those that attend, also look out for some free gelato as a special treat for some of our tour goers. So I encourage you to please join us. If you go into the chat function, there will be a link to the tour if you'd like to sign up. So that's coming up in about a week. So please join us. We'd love to have you there as well. And before I start and introduce the panel, let me stop sharing for a second here. And say that we love your input and thoughts as we go through this program today. So feel free to put in your questions into the Q&A. You'll see at the bottom of the screen, we've got the chat function, and feel free if you want to share where you're coming from or joining us either in LA or not in LA, but we'd love to know who you are. But please add your questions anytime during the program through the Q&A. But with that, I would like to introduce our panel. So please go ahead and turn on your video and join us. These are the guests joining us today, representing various backgrounds, doing lots of good work in Los Angeles. First, we have Dale Kendall, who is the founder of Save Beverly Fairfax, who's also part of the overall Beverly Fairfax Historic District, and really was one of the leaders in helping to ensure that the neighborhood would be listed in the National Register of Historic Places, and we'll be talking more about that. We also have Elysha Paluszek, senior architectural historian with Architectural Resources Group. She's also a principal author of the 2025 Conservancy Preservation Award-winning project, the City of Los Angeles Historical Housing and Land Use Study. And then we have Max Podemski, who's the author of The Paradise of Small Houses. And also we have Lindsay Mulcahy, who's our neighborhood outreach manager for the Los Angeles Conservancy. So first of all, welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. Before we start, I want to turn it over to Lindsay, and if you could share quickly, briefly, a little bit about our home campaign, what it is, why we're doing it, what is coming forward, and what does home stand for. So that would be a good way to start off. So thanks, Lindsay.
Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here with you all, and thank you again to our panelists for being part of today's program. The Conservancy launched the Home Campaign because we think preservation has a role and a responsibility to respond to LA's housing crisis, and that we can be part of the solution to both protect existing and create new affordable housing that respects and advances LA's rich multicultural heritage. This isn't new for our field. For decades, preservation has been using tools like adaptive reuse and rehabilitation to revitalize existing housing and create new units. But the scale of today's housing crisis requires more from all of us. And so we need to think not only how we can leverage our existing tools, but work creatively and collaboratively to identify new solutions and partners to help us advance these complex issues. We see three core areas of alignment between historic preservation and housing that we think a number of advocates and stakeholders can agree upon as shared goals. And for us, that's adaptive reuse and conversion to turn existing buildings into new housing, protection and reinvestment in older multifamily housing, RSO housing, sometimes called naturally occurring affordable housing, and then promoting compatible infill development that minimizes displacement or demolition of existing historic materials. So our goal with this campaign is to raise awareness about preservation's roles and tools, create new partnerships across sectors, and advocate for policies around shared preservation and housing goals. Lastly, I'll just say that housing is far more than a unit, and really core to the preservation ethos is thinking about, again, like this series, the people that inhabit places, and places as being latent with meaning and significance that helps us connect to our community, to our city, and our sense of self. And so we really want to make sure that any conversation around housing is really embodying a human-centered approach. I'll pass it back to you, Adrian.
No, thank you. I think it was great. And that is the background. And I will say most of the conversation we're talking about today is that second component that Lindsay talked about, the three elements that we're working on in terms of existing, older, and historic multifamily housing. Sometimes it's referred to as naturally occurring affordable housing, or NOAA, although not everyone prescribes to that description in terms of that. But it is looking at what do we have now that's serving a critical need in terms of housing in general, whether it's classic affordable housing or just housing that may be rent stabilized ordinance or RSO housing that is really critical in terms of really the largest concentration of existing affordable housing across the city. And so both through this program and the tour that we're doing on the 19th is really to talk about what does that look like? What are the stories? As Lindsay said, it all comes back to the people and understanding this is a critical, important role in terms of housing for everybody. So with that, We're going to start in this order. Alysha's going to kick us off, talking in some ways, really in many ways, about this origin story and where we are. And then we're going to talk with Max. He's going to share more, some with his book and typologies and what does it look like. And I hope you'll talk a little bit about dingbats, which some love them, some don't understand them, and some may hate them, and hopefully will change their opinions about those as we talk further about that type of multifamily housing in LA. And then we're going to go to Dale and a larger conversation about some of the work that's happening around Beverly Fairfax. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Elysha and say thank you again for being part of this.
Thanks so much, Adrian. Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be here. So I will be giving what I hope will be a very short history of multifamily housing in LA, focusing mostly on the first few decades of the 20th century. But I will be talking both about single and multifamily housing a bit, because you sort of can't talk about one without talking about the other. And me. Share my screen. All right. So multifamily housing has a very long history in American cities, but by the late 19th century, it had taken on negative connotations. As Eastern cities rapidly urbanized, multifamily housing became equated with immigrants, the working class, and people of color. This housing and the people that lived there also became equated with disease, so-called blight, and other issues that progressive era reformers were trying to address at the time. This reputation stuck for decades to come to multifamily housing, and it shaped both zoning and the landscape of cities such as LA. In LA, city leaders at the beginning of the 20th century sought to create a so-called ideal suburban city that was free of the so-called problems of industrialized cities on the East Coast. In many ways, LA was poised for this, since it had large amounts of open land and it lacked the established development patterns of Eastern cities. However, the city couldn't be solely residential. Industry and other development was necessary, and there came this complex push and pull between ideology and necessity. And because multifamily housing had negative connotations to some at the time, this push and pull took on racial and class dimensions as well. And so though LA was portrayed as a city of homes and the land of sunshine, the reality on the ground was a lot more complex than that, even by the 1910s and the 1920s. The city had a range of housing types, including a lot of multifamily housing. And LA was not unlike other cities at this time in that way. However, it did have a higher proportion of single-family housing, and boosters promoted that as a way to distinguish LA from other urban areas that were also growing at the time. The single-family home was increasingly glorified, while multifamily housing was merely tolerated at the time. And though this simplifies a complex issue, it gives an indication of the divisions in opinions on housing and people's actions at the time. Early residential districts, such as the Black areas in this illustration, allowed multiple types of land uses, including multifamily housing, unless they were specifically excluded. And it was often only specific so-called noxious uses that were excluded. And therefore, zoning was pretty heterogeneous, even by the 1920s. And city leaders realized that they wanted more regulation if they wanted to, quote unquote, protect wealthier residential areas, namely single family, which at the time was one of their foremost goals. Planners thought that zoning could regulate land use and create coherent neighborhoods. And as a result, the city passed its first zoning ordinance in 1921. This was not the first legislation that the city passed to regulate land use, but it was the first legislation that reflected zoning as we think of it today. The new ordinance established different zones, with each zone allowing different uses. And in most zones, there was no division between single and multifamily housing types. Thus, in some of these areas, both single and multifamily housing was constructed, and you ended up with parts of the city that looked like the image on the right, which is in the Wilshire district. But the desire to quote unquote protect white, wealthy, single family neighborhoods had as much influence on zoning as anything else at the time. But at the same time, LA's rapid growth in the 1920s drove a high demand for housing, and more large-scale apartment buildings were constructed than were anticipated. In some neighborhoods, a mix of housing types and scales were built near each other, and this upset residents and homeowners in these areas. Some critics also thought that these large-scale multifamily buildings were too reminiscent of East Coast cities and the issues that those cities had. And despite the promotion of LA as a city of homes, multifamily housing construction actually outpaced that of single-family housing by the end of the 1920s. But this was still at odds with planners' desired outcomes for the city. It quickly became evident to them that more categorization was needed, and they would continue to hone the city's zoning ordinance in the decades to come. By the 1930s, housing guidelines by the Federal Housing Administration put a strong emphasis on single-family housing. But that is not to say that multifamily housing construction stopped, of course. LA continued to grow rapidly, especially during and after World War II, driving a continued demand for housing. But the ideal of suburban development maintained a strong hold. There continued to be an emphasis on single-family housing construction, and much of the multifamily housing that was built continued to be relatively small in scale. And I will end with a slide sort of illustrating some of the types of multifamily housing that were sort of idealized at this time. A lot of the time, multifamily housing was encouraged to be constructed on a small scale. Duplexes and fourplexes were very popular because they could fit in with established single family neighborhoods. And I figured that this was a good note to end on, since Max will be talking about housing typologies. So with that, I will turn it over to Max.
Great. Well, thank you, Elysha. Can everyone see me? Can you
Yes.
hear me? Great. So yeah, thank you, everyone. My name is Max. It's great to be here and have such a great attendance. LA in general has a really great tradition of multifamily housing. We're known for single family housing. But we do have this amazing tradition of, small and large apartments. And I think we really saw that in the cover photo of this presentation. And, one of the things that sort of struck me about that collage of images is, unlike other cities, like, we think of New York and the tenement, or Boston and the three-decker, or even, San Francisco with the Victorian, there's sort of no single multifamily building type that defines our city. But there's really this incredible diversity, and we have, everything from, townhouses built like French chateaus, to Spanish-style fourplexes, to, large brick apartment buildings, and even, a tradition of, modernists like Irving Gill and Rudolf Schindler building apartments. And, the Mid-Wilshire district and Fairfax and that area is really, a neighborhood that really epitomizes this diversity of housing. You can be on a block and sort of see this variety of housing types and also scales. But one thing that really does define multifamily housing in this city, especially if we're talking about multifamily housing from the early 20th century, is its access to air and light. So those, images that Elysha ended on, you could walk past those buildings and not even really realize that those are multifamily buildings, because they look like single family homes. And that was because, early on, it was very important for apartments in Los Angeles to incorporate air and light, because that's really, was the main impetus for a lot of people to come to this city. So a lot of apartments, have their own door. So instead of going down a hallway, you have your own door facing the outside. And that's really achieved usually by stacking apartments on top of each other, as we see in a lot of fourplexes. They have air and light usually on 3 or sometimes all 4 sides, so ample access to air and light. And also often have open space, which could come in the form of, a small yard in front or even a patio. And that really gives, dense neighborhoods in the city a very different character. So you could have a neighborhood here in LA that has the same population density as a, neighborhood in San Francisco or Philadelphia or Chicago or Brooklyn, but it feels very different because, the buildings are sort of set back on their lot. They have spaces in between them, and they're sort of buffered from the sidewalk by open space. And while, as Elysha talked about, multifamily housing was demonized in a lot of cities, particularly on the East Coast, in the early 20th century, in the teens and 20s here in LA, multifamily housing was actually celebrated here, and it was considered sort of this, how LA was sort of this anti-city, and even our multifamily housing sort of is in tune with the climate and the environment. And there were actually attempts, at the state level that would have made it more difficult to build multifamily or small 4 and 5 plexes that was actually rebuffed by the city council here because it was considered sort of this integral part of neighborhoods. But over the years, we sort of added a progression of laws, and we sort of see this in the various zoning codes that sort of adds more and more restrictions. So as Elysha mentioned, our earliest zoning codes really allowed for density across the city. One thing that's important to remember is, there were protections on single family home neighborhoods, but those were actually in the deeds of those houses that restricted, what could be built on them and also who could live in them, particularly not allowing people of color to live in those homes. But that was sort of a private agreement. But, in terms of the city's zoning laws in the early 20th century, you could build density across the city. But what we start to see happening as early as the 1930s is we get things like setback requirements going in. And most importantly, we see parking requirements. So, a lot of these multifamily housing examples that we're talking about are built on single family home lots, so 6,000 to 5,000 square foot lots. So incorporating parking, makes it very difficult to build some of these more traditional examples. And so I sort of see us, unlike other cities where multifamily housing was very explicitly banned, on sort of racial and class lines, here in LA, a lot of it was almost done on accident by sort of this accumulation of these various building regulations. And sort of the example I see of these building regulations is the Dingbat. So this is sort of if you don't know it by name, I think a lot of people on this Zoom probably do know it by name, but this is sort of the typical mid-century Los Angeles apartment building that's really a rectangle elevated above parking spots. And that's sort of the antithesis of some of these early examples, which are really sort of defined by this creativity and access to open space and access to light. And you go from sort of buildings being driven by creativity to them being driven by the zoning code. And the Dingbat is really a response to both setback requirements and parking. And I really think to the detriment of those structures. So, instead of having a patio that you can walk out to, you sort of get this little catwalk that you use to access your building. Instead of it, facing the street with a courtyard and a front porch, that sort of makes it seem like a single family home and, makes it neighborly. It's faced to the street with, parked cars in a driveway. And, from sort of the, 50s, when these zoning codes sort of result in the Dingbat, you then get even more draconian measures to block multifamily housing. And I think we can sort of like trace it to policies that turn multifamily housing into something that was celebrated into something that really, did sort of degrade a lot of communities. And so I think, when we're talking about, the qualities of these structures, the qualities that we appreciate, and also how to combat the housing crisis and build structures that are sort of in line with the character of Los Angeles and the character of our neighborhoods, I think we need to go back and revisit some of these policies, right? And almost sort of return to the past in a way.
Let me throw up an image of a dingbat just for those that may not know, just so that we can see that. Maybe you want to describe a dingbat based on this example, Max, a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So, this is sort of a quintessential dingbat. That one looks maybe a little larger than a standard one,
Yeah.
but really driven by the parking. So we sort of see the ground floor is parking in front, and sometimes there'll be a little driveway in the back with extra spaces, and then the units are elevated above. And sort of you have outdoor access through a catwalk. This one's sort of a little different because you have, an actual unit facing out to the street, but sort of the prototypical dingbat, usually the portion facing out to the street is sort of just a stucco-clad box, and it often has, the sign of the building and ornament on the front.
Great, thank you. It's always good to have a visual, and like Max said, probably a lot of people joining us know what a dingbat is, but just in case, that is definitely a little larger than the typical dingbat. Before we start with Dale, I have a question for both you and Elysha, because you talked a little bit about this, whether you want to call it demonization, but this kind of, the way multifamily has traditionally been looked upon. And I would say that's still true today in terms of this whole single family, multifamily divide. And you could manifest that in the YIMBY, NIMBY arguments that are rife through our city and honestly all across the US in terms of how people either want to see multifamily built or where they want it to happen. But I'm just curious, I think of neighborhoods like Leimert Park and I'm just curious if you think that's a very rare example of where it was intentionally developed and designed with the idea that there was multifamily on the numbered streets or on the boulevards, and then on the numbered streets, it's single family. Very intentional in terms of integration of multifamily and single family. One of the Carthage neighborhoods also has a lot of multifamily mixed in with some single family. So how do things like that happen in LA, or how rare is that when you look at this kind of, again, the mix of these two types of housing, either in concert or conflict?
That's really good. That's a very good, very complex question. I think in some ways, like a neighborhood like Leimert Park is, in some ways like a bit of a unicorn of an example, since it was planned very intentionally, and a lot of other places in LA, the construction tended to be more organic. And I think a lot of what happens with multifamily housing in LA, especially in the first part of the 20th century, is this sort of like push and pull that I was talking about, this sort of idealized kind of vision of LA that some people wanted to play out, is, very suburban, very open, very low scale. And then sort of the reality on the ground that happened by necessity because of the growth of LA and the rapid growth that it saw. And also other, like kind of other ideologies and other players. Like it wasn't just people who wanted single family housing that, had a voice at this time. There were like so many other groups, that were very influential, that really did want multifamily housing and want apartment construction. I don't know if that answered the question. I hope that.
No, it's great. No, appreciate it. I agree. It's kind of a unicorn. Max, do you want to?
Sure. I think, one thing it's important to remember is sort of, the idea of sort of these monocentric neighborhoods of all apartments, all single family homes is really a very recent phenomenon in our country's history that really dates from post-war federal policy that really imposed that on cities. And, if you go to a sort of pre-war neighborhood anywhere in the country, from a small town to a big city, you see a diversity of housing, right? You see multifamily homes right next to single family homes and large apartments. And especially, you know, those examples you mentioned, you know, one thing that defines them, right, is the scale is it's pretty much the same. You know, you have like an apartment building that's 2 stories next to a single family home that might be 2 stories. They're built in a similar style. You know, they're set back with a front yard. But I think, you know, we can't sort of separate the architectural component from the social component. And, you know, throughout American history, we sort of have this theme of multifamily housing being associated with immigrants, working class people, people of color. And a lot of I honestly think, you know, one of the reasons why multifamily housing was accepted more in LA than, for example, in cities on the East Coast is, you know, if we're talking about the early 20th century, LA was one of the whitest cities in the country, right? And the people coming here were, you know, from the Midwest, they were middle class, much different than, you know, cities on the East Coast where it was, you know, immigrants and African Americans inhabiting those neighborhoods. And so, you know, the backlash of multifamily housing usually isn't always architectural. It's mostly about the people who are living in those buildings. And I think like the idea of, you know, when we're talking about neighborhood character, right, it's not just architecture that people might be talking about, it's also people living in those buildings. But those examples we can see, you know, architecturally, multifamily housing can definitely coexist with single family housing in close proximity.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. I'd like to turn over to Dale now. And again, Dale is with Beverly Fairfax. And maybe Dale, if you could start by like, how would you describe Beverly Fairfax neighborhood and your connection with it? And then we can talk more about like why you all sought National Register status and to have that type of acknowledgement as well as protection.
Yeah, we live in a great neighborhood. It's extremely walkable. A lot of people have lived here for a long time because they're in rent stabilized apartments. People are friendly. You walk down the street, you know your neighbors. People love these apartments because they almost are like little homes. They just seem to have the details that you want. The layouts are good. It's sort of home for most of these people. They don't really, it's not like they're renting an apartment and just staying for a while. Most people stay for a long time. Um, People fall in love with these apartments when they see them and the buildings, and we have a cohesive look to our neighborhood. Even people that don't appreciate architecture, they feel comfortable because they're uniform. It just seems like they blend together. It's not all chopped up with new construction and old construction, older buildings. It just seems to flow very well. And I love it. And I've lived here my entire life. So it's important to me to try and keep it as good as we can for future generations as historic buildings. After we started this, it started off saving the historic buildings, and then we realized it's more than just the buildings, the people that live here, and they think of it as their home, even though they're renters.
Dale, for those that may not know where Beverly Fairfax is, can you describe where it is and kind of the general boundaries?
Sure. We're from Beverly, well, we're near the Grove in Los Angeles in the original farmers market. We're from Beverly to Rosewood, which is 2 blocks up. And then in a couple of blocks, we go up to Melrose. And we're from Gardner to Orange Grove, which is just almost to Fairfax. Over 400 parcels.
And for those that know where Television City is, just look across the street and you're looking at Beverly Fairfax. It's an amazing neighborhood, multifamily housing, 20s, 30s primarily, and lots of different kind of period revival architectural styles. But everything Dale is saying is very true in terms of all this fits together, and they are large units. But can you share a little bit? You said you lived here your entire life, so this actually starts with your family, if I'm correct, right?
Correct. Correct. So in the 1950s, they settled here primarily because we're Jewish, and it was a Jewish neighborhood. And at that time, I don't think, which I didn't even realize till we did all of our history, I didn't realize about redlining or any of these things, but they could rent here, they could own here. So it was where they came. So that time I was born in 1964. So I kind of remember the tail end of a lot of Holocaust survivors here that came to rebuild their lives. Um, and I think it was something that they could afford to live here. And it was a place that they felt comfortable. And now it's a diverse neighborhood. I mean, we have all walks of life and people get along, and it's just a great, great neighborhood. People love it. Um, Most people, I would think, would rent an apartment because, they can't afford a house in Los Angeles. So this is because the rent stabilized, people can really stay in their apartments and they feel secure there. And on my street, there's people that have lived here for 20 years. And I don't foresee them moving. They feel it's their home. So, it's a really good thing. These older buildings, they're serving a very good purpose of a nice neighborhood, but also affordable housing.
Yeah. Some people are asking about images of Beverly Fairfax. We can see if we can pull up some images, but also if you want to join the tour on the 19th,
Yes, yes, come
this
to
is
the
your
tour.
perfect opportunity to really get immersed in Beverly Fairfax, as well as Park La Brea, Mid Wilshire, Miracle Mile, and really see the buildings, learn the stories, talk to tenants, learn, renters, and hear more about it. Dale, before we kind of open it up to a bigger conversation, I do want to talk a little bit about the effort by Save Beverly Fairfax. And, you're one of the, not the earliest, but an early recent example of a neighborhood, predominantly multifamily housing, that sought out very deliberately to be listed in the National Register of Historic Places. Can you talk a little bit about why you did that and why it's important to have the neighborhood recognized and how that's helping?
Okay, so it started off with Nora Wyman, my co-founder, who volunteered there was a building that was set to be demolished, and it had a very long-term tenant there, and she um, was asking for help, of any help that she could get. So Nora, as simple as this sounds, put flyers up around the neighborhood on poles. I had never met her, and friends of mine that live in the neighborhood know I just love old architecture, or even some modern architecture, but I really love architecture. And said, "Oh, you should contact this person. They're trying to save this building." So I contacted Nora, and we formed Save Beverly Fairfax along with a few other people. So at that time, we tried to get an HPOZ. So we had started that process. And then we found out about the National Register. So we got a group of people together, and it was interesting because everybody that we contacted, the residents, of course, they were all for it, and a lot of owners were for it. They loved their buildings, and they could see the history and how it would be good for all of us. There were a few owners that um, didn't want it, but a lot of the information that we all had was not clear. They didn't really understand what the restrictions were. There was a lot of misinformation about what a historic district is. So we went forward, we hired ARG to write up the nomination for Sacramento. And we went forward. We had a lot of volunteers, owners and residents. To get something like this done, you really need like 3 or 4 real workers, and then a lot of people that volunteer to help you. But you need like 3 or 4 good people that can stay on top of it and get the work done. And in 2018, we were deemed historic, and we've been continuing to work, trying to help get other buildings. We've gotten some landmark historical cultural monuments around our area. And but we've also become like a neighborhood association where we help people that are having problems in the area. So it's really brought the whole neighborhood together. So I feel really good about all the work that we've done.
Yeah, it's an amazing effort. We'll put a link into the chat to our page on Beverly Fairfax. I will quickly show an image since people have been asking. It's not the best image, it's not the definitive image of Beverly Fairfax, but this gives you a flavor of the type of housing that exists there. Really beautiful examples, mostly 2-story. Again, period revival architecture that almost look like, single family, but they're clearly multifamily, scattered throughout the neighborhood. But again, come on the tour and you'll get more of a flavor. With that, I want to open it up to more of a broader conversation that we've been having, and maybe start with Elysha. Question for you that you touched on certainly in your presentation, but could go maybe a little deeper. This question kind of about how LA was originally zoned largely for multifamily housing, but the whole racist and xenophobic land use zoning practices starting 20s 30s was in large part around kind of segregation of people of color, immigrants, working class communities. How do you think the demographics of multifamily residents or multifamily housing, how's that evolved in the last 100 years? And if so, where and how has that occurred, do you think?
I think
it's a big question.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some senses it depends on like where in LA you're talking about, because LA is so diverse. They're like, a neighborhood like Beverly Fairfax, which is full of multi-family housing, sort of has had a different trajectory than a neighborhood, in like other areas of sort of the core of the city, or maybe like South LA or South Central LA. I mean, I think you see what ends up sort of happening later in the 20th century, sort of after the period that I touch on, is you end up with a very strong contingent of single family homeowners that end up sort of having more of a voice in the planning process that influences sort of the trajectory of zoning. And often they were, sort of white, wealthy homeowners who didn't necessarily represent they don't represent like the complexity of housing in LA, but it ends up sort of driving a lot of the legislation later on, and people who lived in multifamily housing just across the board end up not having as much of a voice like later on in the century as to what is sort of happening in the zone, like on the zoning landscape of LA.
Yeah.
One thing that I really appreciate about this conversation so far is we're getting to step back from our moment in the present right now and see these longer trends. And as Max, I think you said, the real pendulum swings that have occurred over the 20th century. And a lot of the ways that policy is reacting to what has kind of happened organically. And we're certainly in a moment of a pendulum swinging right now. And so for me, it's helpful to remember that that's not just natural, that we're always in response. And one really important part of that, Max, that you talked about was zoning policy and how policy has really impacted not only who gets to live where, but what those properties actually look like, building design in response to zoning. So I know that we talked about this a little bit, but I'd be curious if you could call out, and Elysha as well from your research, and Dale from what you see in your neighborhood, the characteristics that have been really impactful in creating the kind of multifamily housing that people love to live in, and some of the policy or zoning practices that have limited that today.
Sure. Well, I think sort of the early 20th century, the period we're talking about, it's really sort of the golden age of multifamily housing, not just in LA, but in the rest of the country. And we sort of have to like put in the larger context of housing. So, really before we get to the early 20th century, housing in general is, for working class people, for the majority of people, was really like these cellular, like railway collection of rooms. You sort of have like two identical rooms, and we see that in like rural cottages and in, row homes in places like Philadelphia, and tenements in places like New York. And, the bathroom would usually be an outhouse. The kitchen would be like a little stove in a room, or it'd be in the basement. And the early 20th century, we sort of get, the modern house, right? And we get, and it's really epitomized by the bungalow, and, a house that's accessible to middle-class people. And sort of the difference is like, you have rooms that are for a particular purpose. So you have, a room that's the bedroom where you sleep. You have a living room where you hang out. You have a dining room where you eat. And then you have the kitchen that's part of the house. And you have the bathroom that's part of the house. And this sort of trickles down to the middle class in the form of the bungalow, and really, associated here in Southern California. And it's also, you have landscaping around it. But that sort of modern house, it's not just limited to the bungalow and single family homes. It really spreads to all these different versions of multifamily housing. So, these 4 and 5 plexes in Fairfax that we're talking about is an example of that. The 3-decker in Boston is an example of that, which are sort of these 3-story buildings with the porch outside. And then, if you go to Chicago, you have 3 and 4 flats, these sort of like brick versions of the buildings here. And I think another sort of important thing about these structures and about urban housing in general is sort of like urban housing in this country, like Elysha mentioned, has this really negative connotation. I always say, like, if people in school learn anything about apartment buildings, it's usually about the tenement in the New York City and sort of, the progressive era movement to abolish the tenement. But there's actually this very, great history of these buildings, which is that often they were built by and for immigrants and working class people, and they provided a pathway to the middle class. So, a person could build a 4-plex in the Fairfax district. You could order the plans out of a pattern book or a catalog. You could construct that, and then by renting those other units, that was a way to actually pay for your mortgage. And this is, my family has this history. I'm sure a lot of people in this call has this history of, they come to this country and they, buy or develop a small multifamily building, and it sort of allows them to be homeowners. And that's sort of a rich tradition. We're kind of getting it back with ADUs, where people are now sort of building these cottages in their backyard that they're renting out. But this is sort of a tradition that we've killed. And the thing that's replaced it, right, is large developers coming in, building these large buildings. And a lot of people see that as extractive. And, making it possible to sort of build these buildings again. I mean, we shouldn't just look at it as like something, a vestige of the past, and, we should be preserving them. But it's like, how can we create this again? Because it's not just like something architecturally that we treasure, but it's actually a pathway to social mobility, to home ownership, and then doing what Dale's talking about, right, of building housing for the middle class.
I think something you touched on there, Max, and also Dale, you spoke earlier, is that a lot of older and historic multifamily, whether you're talking about more traditional, like what's in the, Beverly Fairfax area or Carthay neighborhood, or even Leimert Park, and then also looking at what came late, a little bit later in the 30s up to the 40s, garden apartments, is the inherent nature of the design of those places. They fostered a strong sense of community because they had green spaces, they had beautiful spaces, they had a way where you interacted. And there's a reason why people live there as long as Dale is talking about, because they are beautiful places to live, but they also are places where your community, your neighbors. And that is not always the case with the kind of housing that's being built today. I'm not saying it's all like warehousing, but it's, warehousing apartments. In some ways it feels that way, where it's more about housing units versus creating a community or a sense of place, in terms of a place you want to be and you want to live, versus this just a stopover before I go on to the next thing. I think that is part of the big distinction here. And it's also part of the reason that we're talking about historic older, multifamily housing, is that we're increasingly seeing at risk, that it is being, in some cases, demolished because there is not a lot of vacant land around. And these are in places where it's close to transit. That's the whole beauty of multifamily and having density. But there is a desire in some cases to create even more density. And sometimes we're seeing it seems ironic or it seems counterproductive to demolish housing, to build more housing and displace tenants that are unlikely to return. So I think that is part of the complicated nature of this and some of the policies that we're seeing both at the city level as well as at the state level that are trickling down, that make it really challenging, from a standpoint of what are you keeping, what are you letting go in exchange for something, what we're needing now in terms of more housing. No question, we need more housing, but how do we balance that? But this is probably a good place to switch over to a few questions from the folks that are in the room with us. Again, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A. Some of these I can answer really quickly. There's a few folks that are asking about the tour on the 19th and saying it's sold out. It's not sold out. We still have some slots. There's various times, and we'll talk a little bit about that more at the end so we can help you navigate on that. But maybe one question that came up, Alan's asking, and I know Max, you can answer this very quickly. Where did the name Dingbat come from and who coined it?
So there's debate about this. Some people ascribe it to Rainer Banham, sort of the architectural critic in the 70s. But in my research, I found evidence of it like going way back to the 50s, and a developer, basically describing it as just something that was thrown up quickly and shoddily built, and he was applying it to like single family homes. So I don't know the exact origin, but it is a developer term here in Southern California that sort of like predates the actual dingbat buildings that we know, but just was sort of used for sort of mass-produced housing, and then sort of became directly associated with the dingbat apartment building.
Yeah, and the example I threw out quickly, admittedly, which wasn't a perfect dingbat example, didn't usually have the little insignia, the little sculptural element that you'll find on a lot of these. Many dingbats have wonderful nomenclature in terms of what they're calling these places. So, that's part of the lore also with dingbats out there. And we've got some great examples. Another question that came up is Tom was asking about Miracle Mile and asking about kind of architecture between single family and multifamily, and asking, and maybe you'll be able to answer these, were they built by the same developer, same architects? How were they marketed different to buyers? If you want, I can share a little bit what I know, like in the example of like Leimert Park, but I'll throw it out to anyone here if you want to throw out some, if you have any answer to that question.
Well, I guess I can sort of speak to that a little bit, but sort of going back to what Max was saying earlier, one of the things about constructing these sort of small scale multifamily buildings that was so attractive was that they could be constructed by like a single person, and then they could, either sell it or keep it for themselves or what have you. Like it didn't require a ton of like upfront like effort or cost. And so it was very accessible for people to build this sort of housing at this scale. And I would say, yeah, I mean, often these sort of small scale multifamily buildings were maybe not necessarily architect design, although architects at the time, were designing producing designs for these sort of mass-produced housing, and then it could be sold, as like, in pattern books or as plans and sort of reproduced in that way.
Yeah, and I'll share for like Limerick Park, this is one example. It was one developer for the entire area, and it was, like I said, it was very intentional in terms of the multifamily and the single family, but part of the marketing materials at the time were that, you may start off in multifamily renting, and it was still very much the American dream, buy your own home, that you graduate when you have the means, then you buy a house in the neighborhood, stay in the neighborhood, it offers all the things, it was very much a lot of marketing behind that. And he did employ some architects that did both the housing and some of the multifamily, and people like Edith Northman did a number of the multifamily housing buildings there. And she's not nearly celebrated enough in terms of her contributions and beautiful examples of kind of period revival multifamily. With that, we're almost at the end of our time. So one, I want to thank all of you panelists for being part of this, and also all the work that you're doing when you're not speaking here in your normal day-to-day lives. Appreciate everything you guys do. And I want to open it up to our Director of Education, Sarah Land, to talk a little bit about what's coming next with the tour on the 19th. And also, there's a number of questions people are asking, is it sold out? And Sarah is the person that can answer that question. So Sarah.
Thanks, Adrian. No, it is not sold out, and we would love to see you at our tour on Saturday, April 19th. Obviously, you've all heard it mentioned several times over the course of this conversation, which is so great because it really primes everyone on the Zoom call for what you're going to see by having this context and this backstory. So the Conservancy is going to be celebrating the multifamily neighborhoods and examples of different multifamily structures that are in the Mid-Wilshire area. Our tour is called Marvelous Mid-Wilshire Multifamily. Say that 3 times fast and you get a gold star. It's going to be a really incredible day. For the morning, we will be touring the Miracle Mile Apartments Historic District, which is also a historic district listed on the National Register in the Miracle Mile neighborhood. We'll be looking at some really incredible examples of multifamily residences. We'll be actually getting inside some public areas of an amazing courtyard that's there. And then we'll also be visiting Park La Brea, the largest garden apartment west of the Mississippi, as a portion of that tour. And then in the afternoon, we'll be traveling not very far north up to Dale's neighborhood, to Beverly Fairfax, where we'll be leading a tour of Beverly Fairfax. We'll actually, again, be getting inside Dale's property, which is going to be incredible, and also a historic cultural monument. We'll be actually getting to talk with people who live in the neighborhood, including a resident who's grown up there, whose parents survived the Holocaust, and he'll be sharing a little bit about his story. And courtesy of Save Beverly Fairfax, there will be free gelato. So no reason not to come. The final component of this day's worth of extravaganza multifamily viewing will be the opportunity to tour the Edinburgh Bungalow Court Apartments, which is an unbelievable, beautifully restored bungalow court, just a little bit north of Beverly Fairfax. It won a preservation award a few years ago. This is a really special opportunity because none of the units have been rented yet. They'll be put on the market for rent in about a week's worth of time, basically as soon as our tour ends. So we will have the run of the place, and people will really be allowed to go inside to check out these units. Again, to see an unbelievable example of preservation and of really sort of protecting and saving such an incredible resource in the Mid-Wilshire neighborhood. So we hope to see you there. And if you have any questions, again, I'm sure, please reach out. We'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you all. Again, this program will be up on YouTube. We will be continuing this conversation about multifamily housing and talking more about the conversion issue, about how do you convert office buildings to residential and adaptive reuse. So that's a broad conversation. So more to come in terms of this. And thank you all. And we'll see you on the 19th and whatever comes next. So appreciate you all being here and have a good rest of your day. Thanks.